We'll get set up. There we go. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Broman. I'm the director of the Wachiska Audubon Society. Welcome to our July meeting. I want to welcome everyone that's here in person and those of you out there in Cyberland. If you're joining us electronically from home, we enjoyed a wonderful potluck tonight, so you, those at home, didn't get to partake in that, but I want to thank everyone for bringing such good food tonight. It's always fun to eat together and get a visit a little bit before the meeting. Wachiska is an independent chapter of the National Audubon with a geographical area covering 17 counties in the southeast part of Nebraska. You can follow us on our website and on Facebook. I'm going to have Teresa Pella, our president, come up and make a couple announcements, and then we'll get back to a couple things before we get our guest speaker. So, Teresa, I'll turn it over to you to give a couple announcements.
All right, thank you, Mark. So one of the general announcements I make is that our next board meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday the 18th at 7 p.m. and we do those Zoom. So if you're interested in listening to what the board is discussing at this point in time, feel free to get in contact with Mark or Arliss and you can get the Zoom link. And just kind of for kicks, current board members who are here tonight, would you stand, please? All right, we have six, yeah, six out of half of us. Half of the board is here, thank you. And if you see these people, thank them for their service and all the great work and hard discussions that we have during the board meetings. Sorry about that. So Mark is going to talk a little bit about our 50th anniversary coming up, but I wanted to just mention the Wachiska's third annual Tour the Wild Side. It's coming up Saturday, July 29th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. This year there are 7 sites on the tour. It's free. There are no tickets, so you just take yourself around to the different sites and see and talk to the landscape owners about what they're planting and why and how. It's a great way to learn and engage with owners on why and how they're integrating native plants into their yards. And you'll see a wide variety. Not everyone does anything the same. It's all very, very different. But it's encouraging to see that there are quite a few people out there now. I don't think we have our third year, we do not have a repeat landscape. So we've been through almost 25, 30 different landscapes over the last 3 years. So there is a movement out there and there is interest by individuals to plant natives for insects and birds and people. So this is an opportunity to talk to those who are doing that. So with that, and there are a couple of flyers I think left on the registration table if you want to pick one up. Or if you want to take a few and share them. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I also brought a few flyers of the 50th anniversary, so those are out there too, so you can pick one of those up. We'll print a flyer up as we get more sponsors, but right now we've got the Wild Bird Habitat and the Nebraska State Arboretum as two of our major sponsors for that event coming up. So that event is going to be December 3rd out at Innovation Campus, which is the old fairgrounds of the university property. Doug Talmy is going to be our guest speaker. He's going to be speaking at 3 o'clock. That will be a free event. It is a $40 charge for the lunch buffet, which will be at 1 o'clock, but you can come just for the event afterwards, but you'll need to get a ticket. We'll have more details coming out later on that, but you can get a ticket free to the Doug Talmy. He authored several books, including Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, and Nature's Best Hope. So he advocates for homeowners to do backyard plantings for pollinators and for wildlife. So right down the road of what we're doing on the 29th with our backyard tours, the Tour of the Wild Side. So be sure and put December 3rd on your calendar or pick one of these up out there. We'll have more details coming. On Sunday, July 30th, the day after our tour, we're going to have Tim Houghton will lead a bird trip to Marsh Wren, and we'll meet at the parking lot at 7:30 a.m. So for you early risers, so that'll be on Sunday, July 30th. If you have any questions, call the office, talk to me. I'll let you know what's going on, but Tim's going to lead that birding trip. We're also planning to have a second Saturday seed collection. We didn't have the one this second Saturday because of the weather, but we are planning to have one in August. On August 12th, it'll be either at Wildcat or at Deacon, so depending upon the weather and what else is going on, what's blooming or what's seeding out at those two prairies at that time. So get a hold of us if you're interested in going down and helping us do that seed collection on that day. Then we call it the second Saturday seed collection. We'll take a few minutes now and see if there are any unusual bird sightings recently. I'll mention that this past week I was out in Custer County at our family ranch, and I saw 3 magpies 2 days in a row. I hadn't seen magpies in that area for years. My brother said he saw one last year, but I had not seen one for years out there. But hopefully the magpies are coming back. I know that they took it on the chin here a few years back. But that was a good sign. So do we have anybody that has some unusual birds that they spotted at their bird feeders or were out in the field and saw? What do we have? Yes, Ann.
First time I've ever seen a yellow-billed cuckoo.
Okay.
And it was unfortunately due to a window kill.
Yellow-billed cuckoo, and it was an unfortunate take on a window. Okay. Lana?
Bobolink that you can carry earlier in the year, but I thought that they went on too. I didn't realize they still went.
I know they do in the sand hills. I'm not sure about up in the Yutan area. Maybe someone knows more about the bobolinks. I saw a few down in southeast Nebraska here 2 weeks ago. I saw a yellow warbler also out at Wolf Prairie when I was out there recently. Anything else unusual? Nothing out of the ordinary? Okay. Well, we've had a few people step up and help us with the after program with the snacks and cleanup and stuff, but we're still needing to get people signed up. So if you're interested in being either the main person that does the social or just a helper, let us know. Arliss and I at any time would take helpers. We'd hate to have to end our cookie and tea after the talk. So if you have time and would like to volunteer for that duty, or even for just 1 or 2 times, let us know. Or if you'd like to bring cookies, we need a couple dozen every time. So we won't have cookies tonight because we had all the desserts earlier. But anyway, starting next month again, we'd like to get some help with that. A reminder, tonight's presentation and past presentations are available on YouTube. So you can look up old ones, or if you want to watch tonight again, because I know Elsa's going to be so entertaining, you'll want to watch it a second time to see what you missed. After tonight's presentation, Dakota and Ethan are going to show the 4th of a 5-part series on wetlands. So if you came earlier, we didn't have one last month, but the earlier months we did. And so tonight is about a 23-minute program on saline wetlands, I believe it is. Is that correct, saline wetlands? I'm getting the thumbs up from the back. So if you want to stay online and watch it, or if you want to stay here, we'll go immediately after Elsa's talk to that, because normally we take and have time for cookie and tea, but tonight we'll go right into that film. So be sure and stick around for that if you'd like. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Elsa Forsberg. Elsa is a graduate student at UNL, and yes, her father is the famous photographer and a time-lapse camera guy. So I think a lot of you in the room know Mike, but Elsa is Mike's daughter. Elsa is going to tell us about least terns and piping plovers and the conservation partnership. I worked for 2 summers for John Dine in the late 80s with terns and plovers, so they're near and dear to my heart. So I do like the tern and plovers. I worked on the Lower Platte and sand pits for 2 summers. So I have an affinity for those little guys. Elsa likes to run. She's also a famous high school and college athlete. I went to Southeast, set a lot of records. So she's an athlete. She also enjoys hiking, reading, and birding. Elsa grew up in Lincoln and received her bachelor's degree from UNL. And so with that, Elsa, thank you for coming tonight. We'll take questions afterwards. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Elsa.
Whoa, sorry. Thanks, Mark. I hope that I get this microphone figured out. Does that sound good to people? Okay. As Mark said, I'm Elsa Forsberg. I'm a graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm pursuing my Master's of Science in Applied Ecology. And as part of that, I'm working as a research assistant with the Tern and Plover Conservation Partnership, which means I get to work with least terns and piping plovers, which I will talk to you all about tonight. Least terns and piping plovers are 2 bird species that spend most of their life, pretty much all of their life, near sand and water. That means that their habitat largely consists of sandy beaches, river sandbars. That can mean coastlines, reservoir shorelines, rivers, and etc., which you will learn about this evening as well. The distribution of least terns in their breeding range, they do have a population that stretches all the way down the Atlantic coast into the Gulf Coast. There's a population along the western coast in California, and an interior population along river systems in the middle of the US that includes our birds that we find here in Nebraska. They hop down south in the winter into the Caribbean and along the central and South American coast. Piping plovers have 3 recognized breeding regions. One, like the least tern, is along the Atlantic coast. They also have a population along the Great Lakes and a Great Plains population, which includes our birds here in Nebraska. Zooming in a little bit, this is the current estimated range of the distribution of least terns and piping plovers in our state. As you can see in the highlighted yellow regions, it mostly follows river systems along the Platte, Loup, Elkhorn, Niobrara, and the Missouri River. So least terns, shown here, are a pretty gray and white bird with a black cap, yellow beak, yellow legs, and they have a distinctive white forehead that is helpful in identifying them in comparison to other tern species that might migrate through our state. They are piscivorous, so they eat fish, and watching them catch fish is a bit of an amusing activity if you get the chance, because they'll be flying around over the water looking for fish. They kind of swivel their head back and forth if you can see them through your binoculars. And once they spot a fish under the surface of the water, they'll drop down really quick and smack the water and then pop right back up. And if they're successful, they'll have a fish that they brought up. They'll either eat it themselves or they might bring it back to an incubating mate on the nest. Females spend most of the time during the incubation, but they do share duties and they share food. Piping plovers are also a pretty gray and white bird. They're about the size of, I can hold it in my hand like this, which is similar to a tern. They've got a distinctive black neck band and a black, what I call a unibrow. They've got orange legs, and their beak in the summertime is orange with a black tip. They eat mostly insects and invertebrates that can be found along moist substrate, so along shorelines mostly. And you'll find them skittering around down there, pattering around. They'll stop every once in a while to peck at the ground and pull something up. And from a distance, the piping plover on the nest, if you're looking through your binoculars like I usually do, looks a lot like a rock. So my field crew and I play a game called Plover a Rock as we're scanning the sand looking for new possible nests. Just a tip if you're watching piping plovers from a distance. Piping plovers are often confused with their cousin, the killdeer, which I'm sure you all know what a killdeer is, but they're bigger and browner than a piping plover, and the biggest difference is the 2 neck bands on a killdeer versus just 1 on a plover. They also sound pretty different. Plovers have a really sweet cheeping sound that I'm not going to replicate because I can't. But if you've ever heard of killdeer, they get a little bit shrill, and you'll understand why the species name for a killdeer is Charadrius vociferus, and a piping plover is Charadrius melodus. So if that helps you out. I also like to compare piping plover habitat and killdeer habitat to squares and rectangles. Not everywhere that you find a killdeer will you find a plover, but where you find a plover, there's a good chance there could be a killdeer there. I've seen a killdeer nesting in a mulched median in a parking lot. You're not going to find a piping plover there. They're a bit more particular. So birds that spend their lives on sand and water need to nest on the ground. So terns and plovers lay their eggs on the sand. The male in the pair will make what we call a nest scrape. So with his feet, he'll kick out the sand and use his body to make a little bowl-shaped depression, and it kind of just looks like a small footprint. And the female, he'll make a few of these. The female will go around and pick her favorite one, and once they're satisfied, they'll lay their eggs. So on this, let's see, it's my right side, your left, is a tern nest, and on this side is a plover nest. So we'll get another look at some more examples of plover nests. So piping plovers typically lay 4 eggs. They can have 3 to 5 is what I've seen over the years. 3 could be later in the season. I've only seen 5 eggs once. It was very exciting. but they're a little more rare. They will arrange their eggs very particularly with the narrow ends pointed inwards. It's very neat. And they line the bottom of it with pebbles. I feel like I'm echoing a little bit. However, I said, whoa, I think I lost myself. I don't know. Are we good? Maybe. I can hold it too, if that helps. I'll just hold it. Maybe. Okay. Okay, I'm holding this now. Okay, so pretty distinctive looking nest. Remember I said that killdeer and plover adults look similar, so do their nests, being in the same family. So on the far side this way is a killdeer nest, and this is a plover nest. The difference again being color and size. And I recognize that the plover nest here looks larger, but trust me, killdeer eggs are bigger than plover eggs and generally darker. It's like, that's not a piping plover. Okay. These are some tern nests. So I consider terns to be a little bit messier. I've seen them nest in what I'm pretty sure was one of my old footprints instead of a scrape. So I don't know what the male thought of that when the female decided to go there, but it worked for them. They will lay usually 2 to 3 eggs and generally have a bit more variation in the color and patterning. So they still have the speckly egg pattern that helps them blend in with the sand around them. But like these guys over here had a cool gradient, and the ones in the middle, all 3 eggs have a little bit different color. So if you find a tern nest, it's kind of exciting to see what you're going to find. This is them side by side again, so a tern nest on that side and a plover nest over here. Can you tell the difference yet? Sometimes it's tricky, I'll admit. So when you've got nests on the ground, your eggs are going to be a little bit more vulnerable to terrestrial predators, say foxes, raccoons, snakes, and coyotes are the usual culprits. And you've got your eggs camouflaged to blend in with the sand with your speckly patterns, but sometimes that's not enough. So what a tern will do, or you'll know that you're close to a tern nest, or rather a group of tern nests, because there will be a bunch of white birds flying around making a racket and just squawking at you, because terns are generally colonial nesters. They'll lay their eggs in a group near each other, and when you get too close, they'll do a dive bomb towards the intruder if their squawking noises aren't enough to get you to leave their eggs alone. And if you are lucky, they'll do what I call the swoop and poop maneuver. So their aim's a little spotty sometimes, but I have been hit by tern poop more than I care to count. So, but yeah, they're cute. But when you have them flying at you with their beak squawking open and little webbed feet like racing at your head, it's enough to make you duck, even though they're not going to hit you. Plovers are birds that defend their nests in a little way that's more endearing, possibly, some might say. They'll do their little cheeping noises and sometimes a lower toned note to get your attention. And then once they've got it, they'll employ what's called the broken wing display, which you may have heard of. It's typical of the plover family. They'll get the attention of you and pretend that they have a broken wing and say, "Oh, I'm injured, I'm so hurt, I'm easy prey, follow me this way." And if you play the game and follow them, they'll lead you pretty far away from their nest area. And all of a sudden, fly away, suddenly fine, and you're left in the dust with no idea where their eggs are. And they're pretty determined. Sometimes I've even been escorted all the way back to my truck. So they do a good job. These birds work pretty hard to defend their nests from predators, weather, and other types of disturbances. And they do it for quite a long time. So terns incubate their nests for about 3 weeks. plovers, it takes about 4 weeks. You can imagine a lot can happen in that period of time. But if they're successful and all else goes according to plan, the eggs will hatch. These are some freshly hatched plover chicks. You can see the other 2 eggs are still yet to go. When they hatch, they are fully feathered. They are a little wet, but if you give them some time, they'll fluff up and start looking pretty cute. You can see, maybe you can see there's a little bit of a white dot on the tip of their beak. That's called the egg tooth. It's a little calcified deposit that helps them peck out of the egg, and it falls off eventually. But these guys, once they dry off and fluff up, they're able to get up and move and get out of the nest within a few hours of hatching and run around. And we like to think of them as cotton balls on toothpick legs. They can move pretty fast too. They just skitter around, and they'll start running around to avoid anyone that walks in, like some well-meaning biologist. And they also can start to learn how to feed for themselves. So we call them precocial young compared to a songbird that hatches, which we would call altricial, without any feathers, with their eyes closed and needing to stay in the nest for a few more weeks to be fed by the parents. The plovers still take care of their chicks for several weeks until they can fly and beyond, but they are able to run around and get around on their own, which is good for them. Tern chicks hatch in much the same way. You can see his little webbed foot tucked underneath, and he's got his egg tooth on and the half of the eggshell that he just popped out of moments before, probably. And same deal, they rest for a little bit, dry off, fluff up, like this guy who's waiting to dry off just like his older sibling that probably hatched maybe an hour before he did. And you can see they retain a bit of the speckling pattern in their down feathers, like their eggs, because they still hang around on the sand and need to blend in still. So, aren't they so cute? You can see his little wing there. This guy's like a week old, less than a week old. As I said, they're mobile like plover chicks, but they can't move quite as fast. Their legs are shorter, and they have webbed feet because they're supposed to fish, not run around and find insects around the shoreline. So instead of running away, they use what I call the stop and plop method. So they see it coming, their parents are squawking at them that danger is near, and they'll just drop down and hope that if they stay still enough, they'll blend in with the sand and you won't notice them. Sometimes they hide under little plants and vegetation that are on the sand. Sometimes it works better than others. And I just have a lot of pictures of them because they're so darn cute. But since they are species that fish, these guys are not going to be able to go fly around and catch fish anytime soon. So the parents will still take care of them and feed them and bring them fish until they're able to fly and learn how to do it themselves. So we consider them semi-precocial, whereas the plovers were precocial. This guy's a little bit older. He's about 2 or 3 weeks old. I would say 2 weeks old. You can tell he's starting to elongate a little bit more like his mom and dad. And his feathers are not quite as fluffy. He got little nubbins of flight feathers starting to come in. But he's still doing the stop and plop. And eventually, he'll get to be a fledgling. So for terns, they take about 3 weeks to get to the point where they're starting to learn how to fly. I saw a few yesterday that were taking flying lessons. It was pretty cool. And plovers take about 4 weeks to get to that point. So this is a plover fledgling, and they look similar to the adult, except they lack that black neckband, and they don't have a unibrow yet, and their beak is entirely black instead of a mix of orange and black. And this sets them up to be prepared for their first winter. In the winter, the adults will also lose those features. So imagine that you are an adult tern or piping plover. Spring is coming to an end, and it's time to go north and lay some eggs. So you fly and fly and fly until you reach a long braided river. That's great. You found water. That's one thing that you need. The other thing you need is sand without too much vegetation and enough area to raise some chicks. And if you're lucky, the river looks like this. This is the Platte River. And you can see there's plenty of emergent sandbars in the middle of the river channel. Not too much vegetation, there's a little bit, but that just might do. So maybe you try there. But maybe you show up in the summer and the river looks like this. The sandbars are pretty small. They're pretty overrun with plants and vegetation that can provide cover for predators and just is not where you want to lay your eggs. They won't blend in anymore. And they're also pretty low elevation-wise and likely to be flooded if the river rises, if it happens to rain. And maybe you show up and it looks like this. There's no sandbars up. It looked like this a few days ago. It looked like this earlier this summer. It changes. The Platte River is variable. We know this. Well, what are you going to do if it looks like this? Where are you going to go? You keep flying. And maybe you spot something next to the river that looks a little bit like sand. Maybe we'll get a little closer. That does look like sand. And there's water around. Those are the two things that you, as a tern or a plover, need to nest and raise your young. So what we're looking at here is the result of the sand and gravel mining industry. In the top, I'm going to think about this, right hand corner, we have an old sand and gravel mine. So how this is created is sand and gravel mining companies extract aggregate sand and gravel from old riverbed deposits, and they pull up what they want to sell, and they'll put it in piles like this. But what they don't want to sell, they'll pump out around the central lake, because as they're pulling the aggregate out, the water table is going to rise and create this lake. And that incidentally creates these expanses of flat, pretty unvegetated sand that terns and plovers like to nest on. And they do. They do in years when there are sandbars available and when there aren't. But they're especially important when there aren't. So think about, most of you probably haven't been to a sand and gravel mine, but maybe you have. But if you haven't, think about heavy machinery, big trucks, dump trucks, bulldozers, and then think about our little terns and plovers with their little eggs and their little chicks hiding in the sand. It doesn't sound like a good combination, but that's where the Tern and Plover Conservation Partnership comes in. So the university and the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission work together in this partnership to work with the mining companies and their site owners and operatives to monitor birds that nest at these sites, make sure they're protected, make sure everybody knows where they are, and that for the most part, the birds and the mines can go about their business. Let's see. So we show up at these sites. We have about 20 of them right now. And the first thing we do is we look for birds. And if we see birds, we'll start looking for nests, which means a lot of binocular scanning and walking around looking at the sand and watching exactly every single step that you take. But when we find one, like this guy down in the corner, they blend in so well, but he's down right here, and then there's a pile of rock and sand over there. The first thing that we do is estimate how old the nest is. So if it's less than a full clutch, like 1 or 2 eggs, because remember, terns and plovers have 3 to 5 if you're a plover and 2 to 3 if you're a tern, then we can guess, okay, this nest is probably 1 or 2 days old because it has 1 or 2 eggs. But if it has a full clutch, so 2 or 3 eggs for your turn, probably 4 eggs if you're a plover, we need to figure out how old that nest is. There's a couple methods of doing this, but what we do is egg floating. So we'll pour a cup of water and drop the egg inside gently. And based on the buoyancy of the egg, it can tell us what stage it's at. So younger eggs sink to the bottom and older eggs rise to the top. And from that, we can estimate the hatch date, which helps us determine later on if a nest hatched, if it failed too early, that sort of thing. And we can tell people at the mines, okay, this nest is going to be there for another 3 weeks, and then we can take some steps from there. After we estimate the age of the nest, we'll mark it off so that everyone at the mine knows where it is, and so we can find it again. And we'll take a GPS location and other sorts of data measurements. But not every site is a mine. So when sand and gravel mines are done extracting whatever they want to extract from the deposit, they're left with a bunch of sand on top of the surface and some water. And more often than not, it'll get sold to a real estate developer. So on this left-hand side of the screen is what we would call an older lakeshore housing development. You can see there's some houses built in, grass starting to come in, not a lot of sand available, but off on the right side, there's a few houses down on the corner, but there's still quite a bit of sand going on. And the birds will still nest here as long as there's sand available and they're not disturbed too much. We'll still monitor them, keep track of their eggs and their chicks, and they go on providing this habitat incidentally amid all of this activity. So here's an example of one site that started out as a mine on the left-hand side. You can see the mining equipment, the sand piles, and the dredge line. In the middle, it's in a transitionary period. The mining equipment is gone. They've started making roads. We refer to this as a transition site. And these places tend to have less activity and a lot of bare sand, which means a lot of nests, which is good for the birds. But they don't last that long because land sells pretty fast. So eventually, houses will be built. But as long as there's some open sand available, this site can still provide nests for birds. And it still does, actually, to this day. I was out at this site on Monday, and we've got a few tern nests right now. The mining industry is kind of changing, though. The flat expanses of waste sand that I mentioned before are what we call a traditional mining practice. The mines are starting to get a little more efficient and not storing as much waste sand on site. And that's what we see on the right-hand side of the screen. There's just, in comparison to where the plant is operating, there's not a lot of bare sand. So they just aren't as plentiful for tern and plover nests. And they're a lot less likely to turn into housing developments that continue to provide habitat for these birds. But housing developments come with their own set of challenges. Instead of contending with heavy mining machinery, they have to coexist with housing construction, people's dogs and cats, and just residents that want to use their sandy beaches and their lakes. So what we do at these sites is we have our signs. We'll mark off the area where the nests are to let people know what's going on, where the birds are, and for the most part, we don't have any trouble. Because people know the birds need to do their thing, and they'll do their thing, and we can coexist and move on. But it's pretty important to let everyone know where these nests are and cooperate with all the homeowners out there, especially when we have nests that sometimes are pretty close to houses, like in this picture. This nest has 1 egg in it, which means it's 1 day old. And here we've got an example of a tern nest in this empty lot that hasn't been built upon yet, but there's some houses going up in the background. So one thing we do to protect these nests a little further, at least for piping plovers, is put up protective nest exclosures. The adult can walk in through the wire squares to get in and out of the nest as they need to, but it prevents predators from getting in and helps serve as an extra, very visual barrier for anyone walking around or trying to drive around and keep that nest pretty protected. They're commonly used for piping plover management and do seem to improve nest success. Another thing we do with these birds is we band them. So like this piping plover here has some colorful tags on his legs, and those tags in their specific color combination and number serve as a coded name tag for these birds. So whenever we see them again, we can read that combination and look it up, and we know exactly who he is. We know exactly where he was banded, where he's been seen since then, when he's nested, how his nest's fared, and each time we see that bird is another data point. And when we see these birds again and again, we can start to understand their survival and how they move, including if they go to other breeding ranges, like we've seen our birds show up along the Missouri River. And we can also find out where they go when they leave us at the end of the summer and spend the winter. So these are some of the locations that we've had our birds spotted by others. It can be researchers or wildlife photographers or bird enthusiasts who spot these birds, snap a picture, or get a good look through their binoculars and send a report to us. And that lets us know, one, our bird is still alive, and two, this is where he's been spending his time, because they're only here for about 3 to 4 months out of the year, and most of the time they're on the beach. So most of our birds hang out during the winter months along the Texas Gulf Coast, spin around the Gulf a little more into Florida, and there are some that go up the Atlantic, and a few fun ones that head down to Mexico. One example is this guy. His name is Plover 89. Every bird gets a number. And Plover 89 has not been seen here in the summer since 2018, but we know he's still alive because every winter he shows up on the same beach on a barrier island in the Gulf Coast of Texas, and he's seen by a biologist down there, hanging out, doing well, and eating a lot of marine worms. This guy is at least 10 years old, which is pretty incredible for a little bird that is about this big and weighs about 50 grams. Their average lifespan, I believe, is about 5 years. So this is a super bird, as we would say. Another bird that we know where he spends his winter is 56A. He has his name written out nice so everyone can see it. And he was banded last summer in Fremont in May. And then by July, we heard he was all the way down in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, which, go back a few slides, those are those lower 3 points down there. So that's about 1,500 miles that this bird has traveled, which is pretty incredible. We got an email from Francisco down there, as a biologist at a protected beach where this guy's hanging out. And guess what? He did it again, because I saw him on Monday back in Fremont. He had a nest this summer, and he had 2 chicks when I saw him. There were 2 eggs still to go. They were actually on an earlier slide today. So you've seen the bulk of 56A's family this year. We'll see if he does it again. We've also banded chicks over the years. This is a plover chick. He's not more than 3 days old, I would say. He has a name tag too. We band tern chicks as well. And by doing that, we can keep track of them through the year and see how the chicks survive over the summer, who makes it to the end, who can fly, and then we get to see where they go after that if they're seen again. Sometimes chicks will disperse from their natal area, so they might not come back here. They might go to the Missouri River, they might go to the Niobrara, and we might find out where they spend their winters, just like the adults that we band. When we band them, we also take measurements. So everybody gets weighed. We'll measure their legs and their beaks and their wings. And all of that data is collected into quite a long-term database that we have now that I am very lucky to be working with for my master's research. So for my project, I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm currently looking at the survival of nests, chicks, and the adults over the years, and what that's like for our birds that live at these off-river incidental habitats created by the sand and gravel mining industry. And another thing that I'm interested in is, you see how we're weighing this guy, and he weighs about 6.5 grams. When we measure how much these chicks weigh as they age, we can get a growth rate of how fast they grow. And you can imagine that a chick that grows faster is probably living in a little bit higher quality habitat with access to good food. They're not enduring too much stress, and they're probably going to have a better chance at surviving. So one of the things I want to know, diving into our database, is there a difference between the growth rates of chicks at our mine sites, or when they become a transition site, or a housing development? So I'm working on this analysis right now, and I'll give you a little sneak peek with the caveat that it's a preliminary analysis. I'll throw up a jumbled scatter plot. So we have the age of the chick measured in how many days old they are since hatching on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is how much they weigh, so their mass in grams. And you can see they get bigger as they get older. Most of us do. And I've color-coded them, so the pinkish dots are chicks that grew up at housing developments. The green dots are chicks from mines. Excuse me. And the blue dots are chicks that grew up at those transition sites that are in between a mine and a housing development. It looks a little jumbled up like this, but maybe if we throw some lines on it, it might help. So I've got a simple regression lines going here that can maybe show us some trends going on with our chicks. So on this right side, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference between how fast the chicks grow for turns. But on the left side, that pink bar for housing developments is a bit higher than the other two for mines and transition sites. So that tells me there might be something going on at our housing developments that makes them a little bit better for chicks, plover chicks that are trying to grow up, get bigger, survive, and become adults. And that excuse me, lends a little bit of how important these sites are as they progress through the stages. And if we think about the changing mining practices and how newer techniques aren't going to create as much sand that won't turn into longer term habitats, it's something to think about, because these sites do provide habitat for birds when there maybe isn't something on the river or supplementally, and they're pretty important for the birds in our region. So it's mid-July. This guy is getting to be pretty grown up right now. The plovers are starting to disperse. Fledglings are growing up. Seen a lot of them the last couple of weeks, which is very encouraging. But soon they'll leave us and the field season will wrap up. And we can just hope to see them all again next year. So if you'd like to learn any more after today, we do have a website for the partnership. It's turnandplover.unl.edu. And the Platte Basin Time-Lapse team also on their website has done a story, several sections. There's some great material on there about the partnership and the nests and the eggs and the chicks and all that sort of fun stuff. So if you have any questions too and want to learn more from me right now, I can answer some questions. Yeah.
How do you split birds and chicks before you put the bands on? Any risk of human scent changing their behavior and the behavior of their parents?
So they're not sedated. They, for whatever reason, are pretty calm when we have them in hand. So the way that we catch them is the chicks will just be around on the ground, especially if they're doing that drop and plop. The adults, we don't ban the tern adults because they're too difficult. But the plover adults, we have I don't have a picture of it, but just a sort of small-ish wire box cage that has a door on one side. And we'll put it over the nest, walk away, and the bird will go walk in the door. And once they sit, well, sometimes it takes them a little while to figure it out, but they'll go walk in the door and sit down, and then we'll go get them, and we face the door towards us because we're thinking ahead. And they try and go in the opposite direction, but there's no door that way. So we'll walk up, block the door, there's a trap door in the top, and pull him out. And then when he's in my hand, as long as you're, not giving them wiggle room, they just kind of hang out. So they're pretty calm while we have them, and then we put the bands on and take them back out to the sand, take the cage off of the nest, and just let them go. And they're just fine. Yep.
Does the human scent change their behavior?
Not that we've seen. Mm-mm. Yep.
We'll try to use the microphone so people at home can hear the questions. So
Okay.
we'll go ahead and walk around with the mic.
Lana, would you just be on that side with the mic and walk it around too?
Okay, so there's this little, what was it, a plover?
Mhm.
With 4 bands on, it looked like?
Yeah.
Red, yellow, green, and its name, or its
Mhm.
number. So what's all that mean? And it just seems like a lot on a little, little bird.
Yeah. Let's see, we can go back here. If I point it, there we go. So what the most important meaning is the larger light blue, bigger flag on the top. And the color light blue means that it was banded in the Platte River area. The other colors are just combinations that we use to have enough combinations to know it's an individual of ours, or which one it is, if that makes sense, kind of like scrambling colors around. So this one's yellow, green, gray, red. There might be another one that's yellow, green, red, red. That's just its number, basically. There will be other research groups that might have a green flag. That would be one that would span on the Missouri River, or a red flag, or an orange flag. So the top flag means something. The other ones are just like a license plate, sort of. Yeah.
We got a question over here.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Do you keep any records, or do you notice what percentage of nests are successful? Because of course, when you have bird nests, they don't always make it. There are various things happen.
Yeah, we do. Yep. And every year we put out a report for what happened that year. And I'll plug the website. It can usually be found on there. So once this season is over, I'll crunch those numbers and I can let you know what the success was from this year.
Another
Yeah.
question way over there. Just a minute. Lana, can you get the mic over there?
Are the two species in the same areas of the sand pit or whatever, or are they discrete?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, is the short answer. So plovers will arrive here first, usually late April to May, and pick their nest very carefully. And then the terns will arrive in May and June and tend to say, ooh, that plover liked that spot. I'm going to go right there. And so they will be in similar areas. Not all the time. There's some places that terns seem to be less tolerant of little weeds and vegetation than plovers are. So sometimes we'll have a site with only plovers and not terns, where there's other areas that are more terns and not plovers, but they do nest near each other quite a bit. Mhm.
Do they tend to come back to the same place every year?
They do sometimes. Yeah, it might depend if they were successful or not the previous year. This guy, he was banded at a mine and last year, and this year where I saw him is right next door at a housing development. So it's the same spot, but sometimes they do move around. Yeah.
More questions? Tim? Teresa, over
Yeah,
there
I
first.
have one, just a quick one. So are you able to also see how many are actually nesting on the Platte River sandbars?
That has been a bit of a question in recent years. We did survey the river up until about 2017 with kayaks, and then things happened in 2019 that we all know about, and then COVID happened. So we were going to get back on the river this year, but then there weren't any sandbars. So yeah, that's we're working on that right now. Yeah.
Is it possible to say what the mortality, what the cause of mortality is for the birds on the average?
The cause for like the adults and the chicks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would say there's always predators. Found a few that got nabbed by something this year, whether it's foxes and coyotes or sometimes owls are a problem for the chicks. There's also just exposure to the elements. I've seen a tern that was on the nest and had probably been hit by hail. Sometimes the chicks, if it's really, really hot or really hard rain, that'll get to them too. And nest-wise, sometimes if the birds are disturbed enough to out of their area, they'll just leave and try to go somewhere else. So a mix of those factors mostly.
Elsa,
Mhm.
what are the numbers overall? Are they increasing, decreasing? Are they where are they going? Where are they headed?
That's a great question. I realize I forgot to mention. So the least terns were endangered federally. They were listed in 1985, I believe, but they were around 2,000 at that time, and they've increased to about 18,000 now. So in 2021, they were removed from the endangered species list because they've been increasing so well. In Nebraska, we still have them protected as a state endangered bird, and the piping plover are on the federal list and our state list listed as threatened. So it's just one rung below endangered. They aren't really increasing right now. Yeah.
Are they still doing nesting in August? You think of more sandbars when the irrigation, when they've had all this irrigation, there's a lot more sandbars. But or do they just do it in the spring?
So plovers are basically done once we have, I think, one plover nest left right now out of the almost 40 that we've had all year. Terns are starting to wrap up as well, but they'll finish. There's usually one or two straggler nests that go into the first week of August or two. But by that point, the chicks need to be grown up, getting their big kid feathers on and thinking about heading south.
Any other questions here, guys?
So what is the mating process? Or
Well,
what does it look like?
so there's a few courtship behaviors that they'll do. I've mostly observed it in plovers, personally. The male sometimes will fly around an area calling constantly to say, "This is mine." That's sort of a territorial area thing. And the pairs, the nest scraping that I talked about at the beginning is part of it. I've seen the males will kind of like stand up and walk around like this, and they'll also stand up sort of high over the nest, and the female will like go underneath and like switch off the nest. That sort of, I'm sure there's some really cool videos out there right now that could probably explain it a lot better than I just did. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Elsie, you mentioned kayaks. Are they still using the airboats doing surveys, or mostly by kayak and by land?
The airboats have not been used since 2020.
Okay. I had 2 near-death experiences with John Dine, both in airboats. Both were shattering props. One, the prop came up between the 2 of our heads and just missed both of us. And the other time, a bucket got scooped up and shattered a prop. So airboats were kind of dangerous when we were using them in the late 80s.
The things we
You
do for
think-
birds.
Yeah.
You think of them as being so noisy, too.
Yeah, they definitely will flush the birds up. Yeah, they know where they are. Yeah.
Any other questions out here? Well, thank you, Elsa, for a very entertaining talk.
Thanks, everyone.
And remember, we're going to have the wetlands video. I'm going to have either Ethan or Dakota come up and talk a little bit about it before we get it going. We'll get it started here in a second. So if you want to watch, I believe it's on saline wetlands. So I'll turn it over to Ethan now.
Thanks, Mark. So I'll just give a little intro while Dakota's getting it set up back there. So if you've been to any of the past meetings over the past few months, we've been showing some videos about the wetlands in Nebraska. And it's just part of a film series that Platte Basin Time Lapse, which Dakota and I both work for. We produced that with Nebraska Game and Parks, just as some educational material about Nebraska's wetlands. So there's 5 films that we produced about the various types of wetlands in Nebraska. So the film we're showing tonight is about the saline wetlands here in eastern Nebraska. So this is kind of a local story that's near to home. So you'll hear from various people working in the saline wetlands around Lincoln and see some of the plants and wildlife that call the wetlands home. And if you want to watch these films in your own time, you can watch them at PlatteBasinTimelapse.com or NebraskaWetlands.com. There's also some other educational materials on there about wetlands in Nebraska. So yeah, with that, we'll play the film and we'll be around a little bit afterwards if you have any questions about stuff too.
The saline wetlands are made up of a mix of freshwater and the saline water from underground. The groundwater is recharged in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. That water over tens of thousands of years has moved across the plains. As it does that, moves through these bedrock formations under the ground. It picks up salts that were laid down when this area millions of years ago was covered by ocean. And for whatever reason, it hits some resistance right around the floodplains here near Lincoln, and it gets under pressure. When it's under pressure, it wants to push up and rise to the surface. And so when it reaches the surface, it creates a saline wetland. I love the saline wetlands a couple of reasons. They're very unique, and so they're just not found anywhere else. And they're very, very rare, and they're important biologically. They provide a lot of important services to people. So a place to go, flood control, water quality improvement, wildlife observations. You can be back here and you're just outside of the city of Lincoln. You're like a 5-minute walk from the parking lot, and yet you're out here in a very wild space. And so I think that's a real benefit of these areas. I live in Lincoln, my kids were raised in Lincoln, my grandkids are close by, and so it's a place that I can come out and refresh, recharge my soul.
Good evening, Ewide Wangide, Ebeblite Wiblatamik, Umaha Jaje Wiwitate Shonge Hube Wau, Wache Jaje Wiwitate Rene Sansusi, Umaha Waubre. And I said all my relations. My Umaha name is Sacred Horsewoman, and my English name is Rene Sansusi, and I'm an Umaha woman. Our homelands are all eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, and where I live is here in Lincoln, Nebraska. Born here and spent well over half my life here. Our name for Lincoln is Niskide, and Niskide means salt, because this is where the Omaha tribe used to come and gather our salt. Here, you know, in the Omaha tribe book, I was reading about not only, you know, the plants and food, but about salt. And what it said was salt was obtained from a stream near the present city of Lincoln, Nebraska, known to the Omaha as Salt Creek, the waters of which left on the grassy banks a white saline deposit. This fine salt the women brushed into piles by means of feathers, and afterward it was deposited in bladder bags for future use. We took it home and utilized it in any number of ways, you know, whether it was to help preserve our food, to help with tanning our hides. So all the multiple uses we have for salt today, that's what we were doing back in the day, you know, before colonization.
Native Americans had recognized and used the salt for thousands of years, but when we had European settlers arrive in the 1800s, they recognized the importance of saline wetlands and the salts that they were producing as a commodity to use. Salt back in the 1800s was a very rare commodity, very expensive. And so they were taking hundreds of thousands of barrels a year of salt and exporting it out of Lincoln to markets across the nation. But when that industry collapsed, they lost their value to the people. The city was already established, so the city did what cities do, you know, it kept growing. Historically, the estimate that we've kind of settled on is around 20,000 acres of saline wetlands that were here in the mid-1800s. The estimate today is in that 3,000 to 4,000 acre range. And the final thing that really affected the wetlands was the alteration of Salt Creek and the tributaries. Because the city developed along the stream, they wanted ways to move that water out of the city as fast as possible. So they channelized Salt Creek and some of the tributaries. They were successful in moving that water faster, but it started to affect the stream itself. The wetlands got altered because the streams were altered. The saline water, instead of coming up into the wetlands on the floodplain, now discharges into these deepened incised streams, and we get less saline water into the wetlands than we historically did.
I was reading that now we only have pockets of the wetlands left. And I too, you know, growing up, I never really thought about it. There was nobody there to explain to me what they were. You know, I mean, my parents were busy all the time, so they didn't have the chance to take us out here. You know, maybe they didn't think there were locations we could go. But this is my first time being out, like right out on the land. So I really appreciate this time. I look at this, you know, at these lands, and I feel that connection, that ancestral connection to the saline wetlands. So now it's up to us to make that reconnection and come back out here, you know, start engaging again. We can't lose that connection.
The Salt Creek tiger beetle is this really interesting insect that is only found here in the saline wetlands around Lincoln, Nebraska. They're called tiger beetles because they're pretty ferocious, if you will. I mean, they will attack just about anything that moves. They've got these huge jaws on them, what they call raptorial jaws. Tiger beetles as a group are found just about worldwide, and there's thousands of different species. The Salt Creek tiger beetle is one that evolved with the saline wetlands. You just don't find them anyplace else. As Lincoln began to grow and the wetlands were drained, their population started going down.
Probably one of the rarest animals in the world. You know, we have population estimates of 200, 300, 400 individuals, which is extremely tiny for any type of living being, let alone an insect.
Last year we were just around 300, and that's us walking around counting individuals in each of the areas we know they still persist. Nope. Can't fly with a darn. Yep, that's probably one.
Salt Creek tiger beetle is on the endangered list. It was actually listed by Nebraska Game and Parks in 2000, and then a few years later by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a federally listed endangered species.
Once Salt Creek tiger beetle was listed, you know, we really started looking at what needs to be done to increase populations. We started releasing them in 2011. So what we do is we've got these cafeteria trays filled with little condiment cups, and we go out to what we think is a nice area for tiger beetles to be, and we take that lid off and dump out a mixture of saline soil in there and look for the beetle larvae, which again is just this little tiny white thing. And then we have paintbrushes that we use to put a hole in the ground, and then we put the larvae down on the ground, and then we put a little bit of soil on top, and then they're good to go. We get the question a lot of why are we trying to save this one little bug, and it's a good insect to have as a indicator species of how the wetlands are doing.
The saline wetland area that I worked on for my graduate project is called Marsh Wren Community Wetland. I work closely with the Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership. That's a small team of people: Ted LaGrange, Dan Schultz, and Tom Malmstrom.
The Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership goal is to conserve the remaining saline wetlands.
Marsh Wren, about 40th and Arbor Road. That is owned by the Lower Platte South NRD. It's kind of an experiment. It's been very successful. Dan Schultz was integral to the development of that site and some of the opportunities that we're learning from by doing it a different way.
We knew that there were saline wetland features on this property. This was the first time we, in a big way, pump out water to the surface. The wells are between 180 and 190 feet deep. The water is so saline, it's 2/3 of the way to seawater. It's very, very salty.
The salts that come into this system create some habitat, especially for some unique plants. So there's probably a dozen species of plants that are really adapted to growing in these highly saline environments.
Marsh Wren Community Wetland taught me the power of conservation science and restoration planning, because when I started my project there, it looked nothing like it looks like today. It's been crazy to see how much that place has changed. They transformed that place in a matter of 3 to 5 years. They've brought saline wetlands back. So do you guys see the really bright green plants that are kind of right in the middle all by themselves? That's the saltwort, which is a state endangered plant. Something that I got to do recently was teach classes out at Marsh Wren Community Wetland. That was really neat to be able to take college students out and show them a landscape that, most of them had never seen before and they'd never been in before. I always like coming down here to look for tracks, so why don't you guys I think we got 5 minutes left or something. So why don't you guys just take a brain break and explore, see how many tracks you can find. And just like when I was exploring the saline wetlands for the first time, you can see kind of that awe on people's faces and the surprise that it's wait, Nebraska used to be an ocean? This used to be underwater? Wait, is that really salt on the surface? And I learned through the project that there's this give and take. What is that gonna look like when we keep expanding our cities? Are we gonna think about wetlands when we build more neighborhoods? I hope so, because they're valuable.
We're standing in a biologically unique landscape. So it's an area defined on a map that is identified as a biodiversity hotspot. These areas get used by a lot of waterfowl and also very important for shorebirds. Some of those are long-distance migrants that are going up to the Arctic to nest, but they use these areas as refueling stops, is basically a place to bring on food, put on energy, put on fat reserves so they can do their long-distance migration. There's a camera that was placed on a dead tree at Marsh Wren Wildlife Area. Those dead trees or snags can provide important habitat for a lot of different species. And that was put there to just document the different species that might use a dead branch. And so it seems pretty simple, but it's kind of amazing how many wildlife that use that snag.
Turn it on. Now, see what happens. My name's Madeline Cass. I am from Lincoln. I was born here and very much live here by choice because I've moved away many times and just keep finding myself back in Nebraska. Art was really the thing that kept me grounded and was like a source of joy for me. I don't think I remember my first time in the saline wetlands. I feel like my first true experience in the salt marshes was when Michael Forsberg and I took a drive to Arbor Lake one afternoon. I remember getting out of the car and I think I just started to weep. I was really moved immediately by the beauty of the grasses and how wet the ground was, and it was this immediate connection to place. And so I just kept going back out there on my own after that and was really grateful that he took me out there at the moment when he did. Frank Shoemaker was a naturalist and ornithologist and writer. He was a sort of an early adopter of conservation of the marshes and of biodiversity in this region in general. I've spent some time in the Special Collections Archives at the University of Nebraska, and they have all of his photographs and letters. And so just through spending time reading some of his notes and journals, which was a really powerful experience, I really felt like I got to know him a little bit through them. It just really seems like he was ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about protecting wildlife and protecting this region. I really look up to him. So I decided that it was important to promote what was happening in the marshes, especially once I recognized the amount of development that has encroached around them. Wanted to make a piece of art, but didn't know what sort of format would make sense for being the best steward to the land and connecting people to it through my experiences and through my eyes. Recognizing the diversity of materials and all of these different elements, I started to find this little trail, and I realized that the best way to bring them all together in a thoughtful way was through a book. I think that it was something I just wrote in my journal, and sometimes these lines of little poetry just start to kick around in my head, and that was one of them. Just through thinking about this place and recognizing that it's important and it's underappreciated. So I wanted to sort of personify this place and help it have a voice, and it felt like if it did, it would be asking to be noticed. Why are saline wetlands important? I think they're sort of the most obvious answers, which are if we build in the floodplains or if we fill in wetlands and destroy them, then the flooding in our cities is going to be way worse. As an artist, another important one to me is just beauty. I think life is really depressing without beauty. Here in Nebraska, we don't have mountains, we don't have beaches, but we do have magical, weird little pockets of places like this. I feel like every time I am in the wetlands, I discover something new, whether it be about the landscape or about myself. They're so surprising and incredible. It's just like a wealth of everything that we need. It's like a reflection. So I'm very grateful for them.
So everyone remember that on the 30th of July, we'll be having our bird trip out to Marsh Wren, the wetland that was shown there up on 40th and Arbor Road. So that'll be on the 30th of July, a Sunday at 7:30 a.m. So if you want more information, contact the office. I appreciate everyone coming in tonight. There is one more video in this series. We'll probably show it next month. So if you're at next month's meeting, you'll get to see the fifth of the series. So thank you very much for everyone for attending tonight. Ethan and Dakota said they'd stick around for a little bit, so if you have some questions about the wetland series,